Can you hear us? Yes, everybody. Good. Okay. Sorry, this is the first time I posted anything like this. So Ani, bonjour, hello. Les Pedri-Spade, and I'm the director of the Mamwazing Indigenous Research Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome everybody here today. We're here physically in the new Cliff Fielding Research Space at Laurentian University, which is on the traditional territory of the Indigenous and the Wampanoag First Nations. We have about, I think there's 20-something participants on the web, online, and we have about 15 people here in the room. And this is, like I said, the first time that I've had the pleasure of hosting such a webinar, but my understanding is that this is the second webinar that we're hosting. The first one dealt more with community engagement and research, and this is the second. And this one deals specifically with Indigenous research ethics. And so we've been hosting a series of webinars to really gain valuable community perspectives that will all go into the formation and development of our network environments for Indigenous health research large proposal that is coming up, right? So I'm really happy that everybody is able to be here today and be online to participate. And we have four panel participants here. And I'm not going to introduce them. I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves. That's what I'm accustomed to. But I'm just going to give a little bit of an outline in terms of how it will go today in the next 2 hours. So what we're going to do is, again, the participants that are with us are going to introduce themselves. And then we're going to go right into a discussion around 3 questions, okay? And I guess that what we've decided to do is that I'll ask the question, and then we'll have each panelist will have an opportunity to respond to that question. And I think that's going to take us around, in total for all 3, about 40 minutes. And then the last half an hour, we're going to open it up to everybody to be able to ask any question for the remaining time, that 30 minutes that we have. So unfortunately, we don't have a time to introduce everybody because, like I said, there's about 15 people probably now. But when we get to that last part of it, before you ask your question, if you would just say your name and where you're speaking from, that would be great. Okay, so we'll start with the introductions of the panelists, and perhaps we'll start with Julie, if Julie Bull, if she can. I can't see her on the screen, but.
Hi, everybody. It's like looking at Hollywood squares. I see lots of faces, lots of just random squares with no faces. So I'll imagine what the rest of you might look like. Thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Julie Bull. I'm currently based in Toronto. I'm a visitor here. I'm originally from Nunatukuvu, which is central and southeast coast of Labrador, and I'm Southern Inuk. And my work has been in research ethics. So I do research on research ethics. I sit on ethics boards at both universities and in communities. And my passion really is in building these mechanisms so that communities can have engaged research happen in their communities on their terms, and that these processes we have at institutions are not actually impeding that ethical work under the auspices of research ethics. So I look forward to today's conversation.
Thank you much, Julie. Maybe we'll go through here. Donna?
Yes. Where do I look? Where's the camera?
You can just speak right into that mic. I think
yep. Okay, good afternoon, bonjour. My name is Donna DeBosque. I'm from Kamkong. I sit on the Manitoulin Aboriginal Research Review Ethics Board for Manitoulin. And I've been on there since we began doing our coordinating and meeting with our communities in 2001, and then by 2003 we established the MARC committee. So that is my, I'm happy to be here. You got you.
Now maybe we'll go back onto our folks online. It's Paulette. Yes. Paulette.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, hi, my name is Paulette Steeves. I'm currently at Florida University. I I've covered many fields. I'm an Indigenous paleoarchaeologist. I've done a lot of work, however, in the health field. I've taught at tribal universities and worked on creating protocols for tribal research ethics boards. Basically, all the work I do is concerned with research ethics and bringing the Indigenous voice into the center of the academy rather than not. I think this is a really great project, and I'm happy to be a part of it.
Hi, my name is Penny Moody Corbett, and I'm Associate Dean of Research at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. And I'm originally from East Coast, like Julia. I'm from Nova Scotia, but I spent 26 years in Newfoundland and Labrador. I feel very much that that's my home base in many, many ways. I'm actually trained as a biomedical scientist, and I happened to fall into the space of research ethics by being asked to sit on an animal care committee when I was a very junior faculty member, which was followed by sitting on a human research ethics board again while I was in Newfoundland and Labrador. So I have experience with both animal-based issues with research ethics as well as human-based issues with research ethics. And I was telling Joseph just recently, I actually raised at one point we should have an ethics board for plants and trees because they also form a pretty major part of our world, and we don't do that. But I think that time maybe is reaching a change. So I'm from the East Coast. I spent a year working as the director of the ethics office for the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. While I've been at NOSM over the past 5 years, I've been involved with working with the research ethics boards, both at Lakehead and Laurentian University, at Thunder Bay Regional, and at Health Sciences North, and looking at how we might harmonize research ethics to help researchers do their work, but also respecting the participants in research.
Penny Moody Corbett.
Okay, we watch Penny. Okay, so we're going to begin with the first question, and perhaps we'll take turns with who gets to answer first, so that it's not always putting the same individual on the spot for the first question. But so we'll start with Julie, and the question that our first question is, where does an Indigenous research ethic come from? You know, and thinking around, you know, people, place, spirit. Okay, so where does an Indigenous research ethic come from?
Okay, so I think you kind of nailed it there in the overview. It's about people and place and spirit. That really is the short answer to that question. But, you know, for me growing up, the ice and the land and the water were part of who I was. And I always would refer to the water and the ice as my happy place. And, you know, living in Southern Ontario, of course, that leaves something to be desired when the winter season comes. And though I say it somewhat jokingly, it's a real connection that I have. So whenever I visit back home, something happens there that can't happen anywhere else. Even if it's somewhere that has similar conditions, there may be things that are familiar. There's something about home and that connection to our territory. And that's where our ethics comes from. And so in research, it's not a separate way of understanding ethics other than how we interact in the world, how we behave with each other, how we interact with each other, the relationships that we have to each other, with our research participants, with communities, and as Penny mentioned in her introduction, with the land, the plants, the animals, the things that exist and coexist with us in relationship. And so in my understanding of ethics, being true to yourself and doing the right thing can be really hard as an Indigenous person within academic settings, because we're constantly confronted, whether we're students being confronted from professors, or as professors being confronted from our peers in administration, that our understanding of these perspectives and ethics don't match Western notions of biomedical ethics. And so as somebody who has studied both, I have this parallel understanding of how it works. For me, it always comes back to how I am becoming an able human in this world. How am I giving back and making sure that whenever I'm taking from anybody or place or thing, and in research we do that all the time, we're constantly extracting, that whenever I'm doing that, I at least give back as much as I've taken, if not more. So it really is about relationships.
Miigwech, Julie. Donna.
Where does our research ethic come from? I believe it's contained, within our people, in our history, in our, it comes from that the elders are the keepers of our knowledge and our wisdom in our communities, and that's who we turn to when we need to talk to someone about ethics. And they hold the knowledge, the wisdom, they hold the history. So our elders are very important when we talk about Indigenous ethics in regards to research. I think that's it.
Yeah, Miigwech. Paulette. Oh, she's. Oh, just 1 second, Paulette. We're just having technical difficulties. You're muted.
Hang on. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll start over. So Indigenous research ethics comes from thousands of years of Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. In current research protocols, we see that research on humans is defined, but that is not an Indigenous definition. So Indigenous research ethics come from the land, from the water, from all of our relations. In today's world, Indigenous research ethics and Indigenous methods of research have been focused on work that challenges and centralizes Western power and authority over Indigenous life. So Indigenous people have always carried out research, but their knowledge and voices have been erased and silenced by non-Indigenous control in non-stream knowledge production and research. Historically, Indigenous communities have played little or no part in the Western scientific discourses about ourselves. But we have always maintained Indigenous research inclusive of all of our relations. So, to quote Sean Wilson, Indigenous research is a ceremony and it must be respected as such. According to Elder Lionel Kinawa, he's a Minikunju elder, it's not just the period at the end of the sentence, it's the required process and preparation long before the event. It's the many ways and forms and levels of listening, ways of knowing, being, and doing. So I think in this projects like this, we need to be very aware that a lot of researchers don't have an understanding of, while asking the question, where do Indigenous research ethics come from? Because traditional Western research has resulted in the absence and invisibility of Indigenous voice over their own representations. So Indigenous ethics in research projects transform unequal power relationships between the researchers and performance. So Indigenous research ethics and protocols are deeply rooted in Indigenous culture and spirituality, in ways of living, being, and doing, knowing across thousands of years. They don't necessarily come from anywhere. They have always been here. They've always been a part of Indigenous people's lives. Western research and Western researchers are not informed of that. So work like this is very good because in bringing the Indigenous past those academic walls and kind of laying out that research field where everybody has a place, it's going to be really important for researchers to understand research ethics and what they are based in.
Miigwech, Paulette.
Thank you, Paulette. You captured three previous speakers have captured many of the comments that I would make. One being that Indigenous people have a very long history of doing research, and we need to, as researchers, learn from that, from elders and knowledge keepers who can provide that knowledge in research. In the way that I may have been trained as a biomedical scientist to do research was to try to be unbiased and objective. That doesn't mean being unrespectful, doesn't mean not engaging with participants. It happens that in my research, my participants were actually just single cells, so they weren't real chatty. But it means engaging with the communities in which the research is going to be done to learn something of the history, to learn something of a respectful way of approaching, and to learn when to back away, to learn when research is not going to happen in this community or with this group, and to be respectful of that. So that would be.
Okay. So the second question that we're going to move on to, and perhaps we'll start, Paulette, with you this time, is how do or should Indigenous communities keep researchers accountable?
Well, keeping Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers accountable, it's not necessarily the responsibility of Indigenous communities unless they choose or request to be involved in research accountability initiatives. So it's firstly the responsibilities of institutions who are over research and scholars doing research. I think they really need to create a required learning opportunity for researchers so that they are informed of historical and ongoing colonization in Western research. I'm continually amazed at how many researchers and academics don't really have a full set of tools regarding what colonization is and how it's still embedded as violence since the inception of the Western Academy. But accountability and respect, relationality and reciprocity to communities that are the focus of research, it has not been a standardized practice in Western research. So a starting place for accountability is a realization that many researchers, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, require training in this area. So it's the responsibility of anyone initiating a research program to ensure that researchers receive training on colonization and decolonization within research and on Indigenous method and theory prior to the research being initiated. So decolonization is focused on the recovery of health and wellness. It's one path of many in every field to health and wellness for Indigenous communities. So researchers need to be informed. They need to have an informed understanding of ongoing and historical colonization and work that Indigenous peoples are doing to press decolonization. So Indigenous communities are responsible for creating research protocols within their communities, but they're not necessarily responsible for keeping researchers accountable. The work is the responsibility of research community leaders and institutions. And when Indigenous communities request it, or their leaders request it, or they choose to be involved in research accountability initiatives, they will tell us how that should be done according to their protocols.
Joanna.
Well, Miigwech. To keep researchers accountable, I think within the Indigenous communities, there should actually be very much involvement at the local level. I think that local health, because most of us have local community health boards and committees who can be involved in the research, overseeing initially, I guess, the whole project. And then there should be steering committees in place that would also review and provide guidance to the researcher, and as much as possible to pass on those skills to to our people in the communities by hiring them if they need assistance, like people, surveyors, for instance, or someone that can meet with the actual community members. So I think that's one way of doing it, to be accountable. And then at the end, I think that the researcher, once they have their finished product, should be asked to come in back to the community and present their report to the community at large.
Miigwech. Penny.
Sure. So I think, again, many of the items have been mentioned. When I looked at this question initially, what I thought of was meet, talk, repeat. I mean, you as a researcher coming into community, you continuously have to be meeting, speaking to people, and making sure that you are adhering to the guidance of the community, and having community leaders who are specifically involved in that, or assistants who are local, who can give you the sense of the pulse of the community, and the feelings from the community itself are really important. Sometimes you can think something is going well, but you're not really paying attention to the right pieces of information that you're getting. So the local community health boards or assistants or leadership is really important. I think as the hat that I wear as the Associate Dean Research at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine makes me responsible for how research goes on that's being conducted by our researchers ad nauseam. So whether that's learners or faculty members or staff, that I hold a certain responsibility, or somebody in this position. Often communities, I understand, will have research agreements that are developed and created, and those themselves would be used as guidance documents for how the research would go on. And nationally, if we look at the formal policies, of course, that institutions like universities and hospitals are required to adhere to, they do have an obligation to maintain ongoing consent, and that means actually communicating with the communities, communicating with the participants in research itself. So, and there's so many different aspects to research, from why is the research being done in this community, not another community, or how many communities, issues around privacy and confidentiality, issues around how the information is going to be shared when, how it's brought back to community, and all of those questions are places where the community has, I think, a large role to play and needs to be involved. So.
Penny. Julie.
The great thing about going last is that I'm like, well, now what do I say? Because they've all said so many great things, and all of them are accurate. And I would echo all of them. And I think that the research agreements are a really integral part, because when you lay that work out at the beginning, it really helps both the researcher and the community understand, first of all, if this is a relationship that's actually going to work and if it's feasible. And then you talk about the mechanisms that you will use in those points in case there may be disagreement, or when things may happen later on down the road that the community no longer consents to or agrees, and then what will happen in those instances. I also think that as I think it was Donna who mentioned, and also Paulette, that it's everybody's responsibility to hold researchers accountable in this process. And so in a technical kind of way, there are mechanisms currently already in place, theoretically speaking, with the REB at the institution, with the Secretariat on Responsible Conduct of Research. One of the issues that I've been hearing from some colleagues, though, is that when communities or their advocates are going to their institutional REBs or to the Secretariat with concerns or complaints or breaches of ethics, that there's not a resolution happening in the way that communities would like it to. So it's deterring people from actually using the existing mechanisms in place for accountability. One of my favorite things in holding researchers accountable is when communities say no. Years ago when I first started this work, it's a lot of communities that I work with didn't know that they could say no. They thought that, researchers make compelling reasons why they should participate. And they felt, especially if it was in health and if it had anything to do with their health care delivery, even though, they're separate instances, but things can be done in such a way, communities had a harder time saying no. And now that's no longer the case. I feel like one of my favorite things to hear is the student or the researcher who has come to me and asked for advice, and I tell them how important the relationship is, and they don't pay attention, and they continue to get their funding and do all their bits, and then the community says no. And then, of course, they come back to me with tears, and they're really sad that the community said no. But had they went to them at the beginning before writing a proposal and getting ethics approval from an institution and getting funding, then it may have been a different scenario. Which also means, of course, the funder has a responsibility here to also hold researchers accountable. It's not just at the end when we're getting ethics approval for our projects. It has to come from the very beginning when we have an idea of what the project might look like. And so I know in some communities, my own included, as well as Nunatsiavut in Northern Labrador, if we're not included at the ideation stage of a project, then the answer is no. Because that means if you come to us with a proposal already done, you've went too far. And the researchers who do it well and who work with us in relationship, they know that. They come to us and we do it together. Sure, sometimes that means it's at the last minute because sometimes calls come out at the last minute. But when we have relationships with researchers with expertise in whichever subject matter, then we're able to match up with each other quite quickly to do that. So we all have a responsibility, I think, to hold each other accountable. And I especially encourage my non-Indigenous colleagues who are listening on the phone to stand by your Indigenous colleagues when they're standing up in institutions, either at the REB level, in team meetings or department meetings. When these challenges are happening, we need to have people stand up beside us to say that it's not okay.
Miigwech, Julie. So the third question, and we'll start with you this time, Donna, is, well, we've talked a lot about relationships and reciprocity and how these are always central aspects of Indigenous research ethics. So what are some practical activities that researchers can carry out to build respectful relationships and ensure reciprocity in their research?
I'm sorry, what are
some practical activities, some practices, like things people can do that to build respectful relationships with Indigenous communities and ensure that their research is ensure there's reciprocity in their research?
Okay, I guess when you approach the community and things are starting to happen, you get in touch with elders, and the first relationship, I guess, would be with the elders who will be providing advice and guidance to the researcher. So that first should be done with tobacco. It's a protocol that we have in our communities, and it's very important. And it's that as you offer tobacco, they're doing an exchange. They're agreeing to work with you and provide that guidance, so that reciprocity is there right from the beginning. There's also a need to, I guess, when you're working with, there's committees that are set in place, and then you work with community members, and oftentimes, a lot of our relationships within the community and with internally and externally, a lot of times we use food. There's feasts that are set in place, so you provide food to the community, and then that reciprocity is there again, to exchange information, and then you provide them with a good meal. And sometimes even in exchange of a small gift, like maybe a $10 gift card, if you're actually sitting down and doing interviews with individuals, and that's, again, becomes part of the reciprocity that happens.
Mm-hmm. Penny?
Yeah, thank you. So as Donna says, it's really important to meet with the leaders and the elders. I've come to learn, of course, the exchange of tobacco is really important. It's really key. I grew up with my mother formulating many of the ways in which I do business, and she would say sitting down and having a cup of tea is kind of an important approach. So it's not jumping into, this is the research that I want to do, are you going to let me do it? But rather really developing a rapport with somebody so that they know something of who you are and you know something of who they are. And I think that's the reciprocity that I see that's really important, and it establishes who you feel you are able to work with, and some of the sensitivities perhaps that you need to be aware of. So sitting down and learning something of the community that you're going to, the language, the cultures, the customs, that would be important. Taking the time to do that is often not part of what comes from a funding agency. They are very quick. They want the proposals in on a certain deadline. The research needs to be done, and institutions have regulations on time. But to do community-based research, participatory research, really takes time to develop a relationship that may in some ways not appear to have anything to do with the actual research that you want to do. It's really about knowing the community that you are working with, their history, and respecting what you may be able to do, and understanding when you maybe be able to do that, taking in mind different activities that might be going on in the community, at which time you're not free to do that research that you think is really important to be done next week. So it's really, I guess the relationships and the reciprocity is really key to the research being done well and properly and having meaning.
Miigwech. Julie.
I think I love alliteration, so I'm going to add a third R for this part of the conversation. So it for sure is all about relationships and reciprocity. It's also about reflexivity. People need to be asking themselves why they're doing this work. And I think for Indigenous researchers, that's usually a pretty easy answer, right? We're connected to our work for reasons that many people have already mentioned today, and that we are passionate about it, and we've been called by spirit and by our communities and leaders to do that work. For non-Indigenous people doing it, not to say that there isn't space for that, I think there is space for all of us in this work, but it has to be under the leadership of Indigenous people. And so for non-Indigenous people, especially just starting out, it's really important for us to be asking ourselves why. And just like consent is ongoing, so is that conversation with ourselves that needs to be ongoing throughout the duration of not just a particular study, but our whole careers that we can make in an academic institution. I also want to tell a little story about the protocol, and agreed in most First Nations communities and cultures, it's respectful to show, to offer tobacco at the beginning of a relationship. That's not true for Inuit. And so I want to share a story with you about some colleagues I had who were doing commercial tobacco smoking cessation research. And they were trying really hard, and they thought that they did a good thing by bringing pouches of tobacco with them to the north to hand out to all the people who came to participate in their study, because, that's what you do, you offer tobacco. And then, so of course, everybody took this tobacco with the kind of funny look, like, I thought they want us to quit smoking. Why are they giving us tobacco, like whole pouches of it? So, good that these researchers knew that they were supposed to follow protocol, but not so good that they didn't check in to find out what that protocol was. So that is definitely like a practical lesson, that not all communities are the same, even within First Nations, of course, and within Inuit and Métis communities, there is diversity within each of those. And so people need to really, ask the question. For the most part, communities are very open and happy to answer your questions. You need to ask to know what to do and how to do it in the right way, and so then to follow that. And for people to show up as themselves. If I come to a community as Dr. Fancy Pants, nobody cares in the community, right? What my degrees are, what my title is, how many grants I got last year. That's not what's important. They want to know about me as a human. So I think it's really important for researchers at all stages, but especially at the beginning in building a relationship, to know that it's building a relationship, not a research relationship that you may feel like collegial and have a working relationship with the person down the hall from you. Communities really expect people to meet us in relationship. And so I think that we have to keep doing that. And we can show it by volunteering and offering our help in ways, as Penny mentioned, that may not be part of the research project. There's always things happening in communities, and there's always ways that we can contribute a helping hand. Again, ask people, just show up at whatever the community event is, and I guarantee you people will find something to put you to work, which is really helpful. And in all of that, we have to stay humble and to know that we actually don't know a whole lot. Might have all kinds of degrees and know a lot about something very specific from an academic or a Western way. And even if we know them from an Indigenous way, they're just one Indigenous way. So now that I'm a visitor in Southern Ontario, I don't for a second pretend to think that I know anything about what it's like here in Southern Ontario. I learn every single day from the Indigenous people who live here. And of course, many people have now gathered in Toronto from all kinds of different nations. So it's this place where we get to learn from each other. And it has to be, the reciprocity can happen in lots of ways. In tangible ways like giving back by training and education. It can be, building into your grant that all those pieces of equipment that you get, the recorders, the computers, the digital things, leave them there. Leave in the communities more than you take. And if you don't think that your interviews and focus groups are taking, they are. When we're asking people to share their stories, and often it's to share their stories of trauma and difficulties, then we are taking a lot from the community. And it's the very least we can do as researchers, of which I am one, to also give back at least as much as we take when we're doing it.
Miigwech, Julie. Now we'll move to Paulette.
I agree with everything that everybody's said. They've made most of the points, but Indigenous knowledge holders and scholars have stated in many publications that if research does not benefit a community, it is a waste of time and should not be done. So regarding reciprocity, I think researchers need to start with asking themselves, how does their research benefit the community? So reciprocity has many frames, and all researchers must first gain an informed understanding of research's ceremony. Then they will understand a little bit about reciprocity. And in seeking to do research with a community, they need to do their background research on the community. They need to start to learn and understand Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. And traditionally, Western research starts with writing the grant and getting the money, and people need to back up from that. They need to back way up and go, wow, if I want to apply for this grant and do this research, how do I facilitate that? And how do I become knowledgeable about this community? Well, then go to the community, go to community events, meet the community, answer a lot of your questions about reciprocity before you even do the research grant. So in writing research grants, excuse me, they're all framed in Western understandings of research. And so I always have to really work hard when I'm writing into my research grant. Well, I need this amount of money because I need to buy gifts and food and salmon and tobacco, and that question's going to come back. Why do you need food? Like, what are you doing? Because people that are reviewing research grants often don't have an understanding. That is improving. The last grant I wrote, I actually had to call them, and they were very understanding of my line budget for gifting and for feasts. So that's great that when more people do this and bring it into the academy, that makes it easier for everybody else that follows. But reciprocity and doing Indigenous research, it's first about building relationships. And so I really agree with Donna supporting community meetings. I mean, we get research grants, so put a line in your grant for supporting a community meeting and providing a feast and providing gifts. Start to build a relationship. If there's going to be reciprocity, that starts with building a relationship. So supporting community meetings, supporting training for people in the community, to work on the research project, and learning to listen. So reciprocity and working in Indigenous frames and knowing it's just not about giving and what you can give back and bringing to the community. They're giving you a lot. But Western ways of teaching have taught Western researchers to not listen to Indigenous people, to not listen to oral traditions, to not listen to all our relations. The Tri-Council Policy on Funding, Section 9 on research with Indigenous people, lists only research with humans. But I'm going to just cite Marlene Brandt Castellano here for a second. So in a world of Indigenous knowledge, a discussion of ethics cannot be limited to devising a set of rules to guide research behavior in a defined task. Ethics, the rules of right behavior, are intimately related to who you are, the deep values you describe to, and your understanding of your place in the spiritual order of reality. So Indigenous research must therefore extend beyond current definitions of research involving human subjects to include research that affects Aboriginal well-being. This includes environmental research that will impact their physical environments or archival research. So we also need as a group and as academic scholars to address this within policies that we are bound by. And we need to ask policies when considering Indigenous research to include research of ceremony, relationships, reciprocity, to include these languages that we're not just doing research on humans. For many Indigenous people, all their relations are a part of their lives, a part of their health, a part of their everyday being. And I think this project would be a really good place to start asking for those kinds of understanding within our research. Reciprocity being, of course, extremely important to the research. And it's a terminology that a lot of non-Indigenous researchers have no understanding of whatsoever. Granting committees, people that read the grants are getting better at understanding because I do write amounts into all of my grants that relate to reciprocity, that relate to feasting, that relate to building relationships. I'm done.
Miigwech, Paulette. You know, I just want to say that, you know, a lot of the last parts here, they resonate a lot with me, and what it made me think about was that importance of preparation. You know, that, you know, it's a bad journey if it's kind of not set up to be a good journey if the community wasn't even involved in the ideation stage, like Julie said. And it reminds me of something my Uncle Jerry would say. You know, he always comments on how, you know, he runs Sweat Lodge back home in our community, and he says, you know, people like to show up sometimes 5 minutes before going into sweat, and, you know, he says, but they don't realize that they're missing, you know, 90% of the ceremony. And what he means by that is like all of that, all of the ceremony that takes place, you know, to even get into, to be able to go into that lodge that day. You know, for example, like the hours of, you know, cutting wood and moving it around and going and getting the rocks and getting the, you know, and getting the medicines and visiting and preparing. And so, you know, that, you know, I think that we're applying and we're saying these same things, you know, in research as we do, you know, when we're talking about other important aspects of our lives. So I just have a note here from our technical guru, Julia. And there's so many of us that are on the call right now that, and everybody has to be muted in order for the person to be able to speak and us to hear them. So she suggested that we field the questions through the comment section for the folks that are online. So there's a little section that you can type within, and to type in your question, and then we can see who it is that's asking the question, and then we can pose it here. Okay, so this is the time now where we're going to open it up. The next, we're on making good time perfectly here, so I'm doing a good job moderating. That we have, you know, a half an hour here for some question and answer. And of course, that extends to all of the folks here too.
I have a question.
Okay, G has a question, so if you can speak as loud as possible.
Ani, my name is Jason Goudreau. I work here as a project manager for Indigenous Children's Health Research. I have a question. It more relates back to my thesis around insider-outsider research. And I did my research about 10 years ago, and I had a vision to study women's hand drumming and its links to health. And I know when I was applying for research, they said the question's not coming from the community. But what happens when you're part of the community and you have a vision? And I'm just wondering like how people feel about that, because as Indigenous people, we are part of that community, and they weren't granting me the funding at the time because they said the question did not come from the community.
You watch G. You want to unmute Paulette and Julie?
So,
Wait.
so I think that's kind of that's like a running stream. When you are a part of the community, you all are in that same place. So that is important, but you're the one that's the researcher. So on the other side of that coin, some grantees might ask you, is this your question? If it's not your question. So I think as researchers, we need to try to write and create those definitions for granting agencies, because we're not just doing our research. Anyone who's Indigenous that's in the academy and doing research is teaching others every single day about Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. And that was your question. I think that was an important question. Other than that, we need to find ways to try to facilitate our research to get it done in the best way we can. So you may have been able to go back and ask your community, do you think this is a good question? But I think coming from you as being part of the community, that's absolutely legitimate for you to ask that question.
I agree. And I think that this is a pretty common, thank you for that question, because I think it's pretty common. I know I've experienced similar kinds of things in projects and classes, as well as several of my friends and colleagues who are Indigenous doing this work. I think there's a couple things that can happen. As Paulette said, you know, go back, if the funder needed the quote unquote validation from the community, then you could have, I suppose, found somebody in the community that would have written that down for you. It should not be that way. I think my favorite thing that's happening, a shift that's slowly but, you know, growing momentum, is that communities themselves are getting eligibility to hold tri-council funds. And when that starts to happen, and it is happening, that community agencies are holding their own research funding, then that changes everything, right? Because then there's not an additional layer of bureaucracy between the money and the community. The community holds it themselves, and they know where best to spend it. And of course, it's going to take some time for all of the reviewers on these grants to catch up to the way that this shift is happening. But the shift is happening. So I think the more of us that are doing it, that's helpful. And then the more of the folks who are reviewing it who can perhaps take a step back and realize that these are, in fact, legitimate knowledge-based ways of understanding that have been around long before Western science has. My ancestors are from the most harsh climate in the world, so we still would not be here if people didn't do research for many, many years, and increasingly so with the way that the ice caps are melting. So, you know, I think Indigenous researchers, we have the shitty end of the stick in that we have to keep teaching everybody in our institutions on a daily basis. But it's happening. So I think enough of us now are doing it to make a change.
You watch Julie.
Yeah, I also, thank you for your question. I guess we have to make that connection again, that how hand drumming affects holistic health, because, you know, like, we're not just talking about hand drumming as an individual isolated activity. it very much has to do with the person's spiritual health, their emotional health, for instance. I guess you could even compare it to hunting, like, why would you want to teach hunting to, for your health? But it's about the diet, the traditional diet that, when people go do their own hunting, then they get their own, so that is beneficial to one's health. Ceremony, for instance, too, it's another one, like how would that affect your, but it's all holistic. You look at your emotional, your spiritual, your physical, and when you look at it in that way, I think that it makes so much sense. You got you.
I don't think I'll make a comment on this. I mean, I appreciate the question because I think it's a really important piece. And as a member of any community, how do you place yourself when you're told, well, it wasn't a community-based question? It's a little bit, I guess I will make a comment, it's a little bit like patient-oriented research. I don't think there's one of us in the room that has never been a patient. And yet, because we are researchers, we are somehow automatically excluded from that body of being patients. When I sit around committees, that's often the case. Oh, we need to have a patient here. Well, hello. So it's a really important question.
Okay. Is there a question? Yes. Okay, so we have a question, and it is from, no, we don't have a last name here, we just have Ranjit. As a clinician in the community, I often recognize opportunities for research and improvement to groups and populations. How might I respectfully inquire if this is a concern for First Nation populations that may not involve a discrete community?
So I'm not sure if I totally heard the question right. He wants to know about asking about doing research that doesn't involve a discrete community.
Yeah, can I maybe help there a bit? Yes, my name's Ranjit Babu. I'm a pediatrician in the community. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Thank you. Yeah, I've enjoyed very much enjoyed the conversation and the information that's being provided, and I acknowledge our responsibility to engage Indigenous communities at the outset to ensure that the research is of value and it is their research. And the outcomes belong to them. I appreciate that. But I think the conversation was tended to focus on community engagement. But I'm wondering about population engagements. For instance, if there was a research question that needed to be asked about mothers attending the maternity clinic, they might come from a wide range of communities. So how might we ascertain if the appropriateness of the research inquiry from a diffuse population rather than a discrete community? Where do we get the leadership? Where do we inquire for the permissions that might need to be obtained to ensure that the research is done in their interest rather than from our perspective?
I think there are a number of groups that have done research projects that covered a really huge area of Indigenous populations. So your first place would be to look into those studies. University of Saskatchewan has a site, I can't remember the name right now. It's an Indigenous Health and Research Ethics site. But I would send your specific questions to them. There has been Canada-wide Indigenous health surveys done. I don't know if they went to every community seeking to understand proper practices and protocols and research, but those were initiatives that quite often included or were led by Indigenous scholars. So I think for non-discrete areas, you need to look at what's already been done, how they did it, and contact the people that were involved. Because that would be a really big, a big project, but it's also a very important aspect to realizing that it's going to be different, or it could possibly be different in research protocols and practices with each and every community. And sometimes in big projects like that, the leadership within Indigenous communities is very important to answering those questions. So I would also look to Indigenous-led and run professional academic associations, because there are a number of them, including in social work and health.
I think that's great. Thanks, Paulette, and thanks for that question. I think it's a common one that many of us struggle with, and I want to reiterate that though our conversation has been primarily on, community-based or engaged research, that the ethics doesn't change even in other kinds of research. So, I work in a mental health and addictions hospital, so lots of my colleagues are psychiatrists and epidemiologists and folks who spend all of their time in front of data sets, and they never once talk to people. But they do publish a lot about different populations, and it's important for them to also know that without context and simply disseminating that same perpetual stereotype about Indigenous people in the literature is causing harm. I don't think it's malicious. I don't think that people are out there to find the way to hurt people, but researchers, intentionally or not, are perpetuating these stereotypes and causing harm for communities by continuously publishing things out of context. And without having conversations with people, it will almost always be out of context. Because as a non-Indigenous person, or even as an Indigenous researcher, when you're not from that community, you will not know it the way that the people from that community do. And so a lot of the data, the literature shows us that there's a lot of gaps in, StatsCan data, for example, the census. First Nations and Inuit have mobilized themselves to collect their own data for that. There's regional health surveys that happen. I suggest going to places like the Assembly of First Nations with their the First Nation Information Governance Center. There are also regional bodies that have that kind of a survey happening in their regions. The Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami also has that. That's the National Inuit Organization. So some of them are politically driven organizations, but those are the places that are mobilized to take over these kinds of health data sets. So they would be a great place to start to see where some of the gaps might be. I also think it's important for us to offer to others what it is that we can give. So in your case, when you have these examples, clearly there's probably some specific examples that have come across your desk that you say, hey, here's how I could contribute to that project. Let people around you know that you have that skill set, that interest, that passion. Let them know what you have to offer. And then when the timing comes up for other funding calls, then you can remind them, hey, this funding's here. Here's what I can do. If this is something that would be helpful to your community, let me know. And then, be okay with them saying no for a bit. And then when it is a fit, they will say yes.
Miigwech, Julie. That just reminds me of, there's a great article that many of us have already read by Tuck and Wayne Yang that's called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, and it talks about different strategies that often settlers use to absolve themselves from having any sort of responsibility or accountability to the ongoing settler colonial reality of Indigenous peoples. And one of them is the astericking of asterisks. They make up words. Of course, academics like to make up words, especially in social science, but sort of rendering and saying, I'm only working with a data set, I'm not working with people. And then therefore their engagement is just very limited to this stat that they put out there in the world, and yet that those stats have very often negative consequences for Indigenous communities, Indigenous people as a whole, right? So that just came to mind when you were explaining that, Julie. So do we have any other I have a question, if nobody else, or did any have a question? So my question is really about how, all of you talked a lot about how Indigenous research ethics are, I think it was Paulette who said, it's living, being, and doing. And so this points to how our ethics are embodied. And yet, and I think maybe this is, for Indigenous researchers, well, they understand that our ethics are embodied, that we often have to translate that into, and make it quite flat and disembodied, especially when it comes to that process of meeting the REB, filling out the paperwork that we need to do to check all the boxes, in order to even access our grants. And so I hear a lot about how that, I think it is really about moving from how it's embodied and lived, and then to put that, into this flat, this text, and perhaps maybe some of you could speak to things that we can do to overcome those challenges, because it's something that it comes up a lot, and I hear it from a lot of students, a lot of emerging researchers around how that translation issue.
Maybe I can begin to comment on that. I think the Research Ethics Board approvals and forms were put in place with a good mindset, but they have created a situation where the feeling is you fill out that bunch of boxes and you tick off all of those pieces. You've done it. You're finished with ethics. You don't need to consider it anymore. And that is completely the polar opposite of what ethics is all about. It's about actually how you engage, how you, the living, being, and doing. It's so all-encompassing, and the forms have almost done a disservice for what this is. We will be starting a new graduate program at NOSM, and one of the required courses for our students will be a course on bioethics and integrity to try and engage people in talking about why it's so important to consider the topics of ethics when you're doing research. It's not about the forms. It's about doing ethical research. It's about thinking about it from the time you ask a question to who you're going to be working with, how you're going to be doing that working relationship, where you might, if you end up publishing the work, where you actually will end up publishing it. Is it in a quality journal? Is it something that would be available to community or not? How you're going to engage with community after the research project is completed, what that means. I mean, there's so many aspects that's never covered in the forms that we fill out. It just needs to be part and parcel of what you do. And I think sometimes the forms just do a bit of a disservice. They drum it down to it might be a very long form. It might be a nice 20, 30 page long form, or when Julie and I just came back from the Canadian Association Research Ethics Board meeting, and there's lots of discussion about consent forms and how valuable they are. You get a 30-page consent form that you're filling out as you're about to have a heart attack to say, yes, I'd like to be involved in that study. It's not informed consent. It's just understanding what ethics is about, I think, is so important.
I agree. I think that's probably the biggest challenge. I've seen it. I was one of those fortunate people that got to sit on an REB when I was an undergraduate student, because my research, even at that level, was challenging what the REB thought was okay. Because I was doing community-based research with my community, and they're like, hold on a second, you've designed this whole study without coming to us for approval first. I'm like, well, of course I did, because I designed it with my community. This was before there was Chapter 9, before there was the CIHR guidelines. They give me any policy to back me up. This was just, I knew that this is what was ethical. And so in doing that, I got to kind of see how that operates in the institution. However, students and even senior researchers alike have this very skewed notion that somehow it's about the forms. And I don't know how many other ways to say that it's not about the forms. And another, of course, people will often say to me that they are deterred from doing Indigenous community research because of the additional burden of even more forms, because you have the institutional forms and you have community forms or other types of processes. But these are just opportunities for us to talk about our relationships. And if we have done research and are doing it in a good way, in an ethical way with our communities, then these forums are just the opportunity for us to discuss this culmination of our relationship and to really lay it out there for the ethics board to know about and for us to then embody. So you can't just say one thing right on the forums and then go and do whatever you like afterwards. Consent and all of the engagement part of research is an ongoing conversation. So I think that the message really is that it's not about the forms, it's about how we actually interact and behave. So we can take this outside of research for a second and look at the repeated apologies from different governments over time, up to and including this year, and how when actions don't follow the apologies, we have a hard time imagining that there's anything behind those apologies. The same is true in research ethics, right? When people are saying and writing one thing in protocols and forms, but then their behaviors don't match what they're saying. Communities are going to listen to what you do, not what you say. So I think that's probably, enact the ethics, actually do it.
I have a question, and not a question, but a response to this part. At Manitoulin, our application form at the very end has a question on how is the research going to incorporate the 7 grandfather teachings. So, someone can fill out the whole form, but at the end, that's when, they have to stop and think how these 7 grandfather teachings are going to be respected and included in the research that's going to be done. So I think that that is a good response to your question.
I actually, does the Manitoulin, you have
Absolutely no obvious reason.
Never happens.
okay back? It's working now.
Yeah.
Yes? You hear me? You hear me now? Okay.
Good old solution,
Sorry about
unplug it and plug it back.
Thank you.
Sorry about
Flicking,
Yeah.
I just had a quick follow-up question to the REB because I'm the ethics officer at Laurentian, and so I see a lot of the applications that come through, and we've been seeing a higher number of Indigenous research applications come through, recognizing, you know, the very particular factors that come into play when we do a revision of the applications. And understanding that we need to have more representation around the table at the REB level, what would be some recommendations in terms of, more specifically for the reviewers in looking in REB applications submitted by Indigenous researchers or for research being conducted among Indigenous populations?
Yeah, I can answer a small piece of that. There should be a requirement within every institution that there needs to be a First Nations, Inuit, or Métis scholar on every REB. I've sat in on REB meetings and sometimes with other Indigenous scholars that had no clue how the applications they were receiving were not following Indigenous research methods, had no clue of Indigenous knowledge, just didn't even know where to start. So they were approving things that were completely unethical. So the second piece of that is that all REBs in Canada should have to take modules and training on Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous research, Indigenous ethics, because I've just personally experienced, I've been on a part of 3 different REBs, and there wasn't a single person that had an understanding of Indigenous research ethics. There's a rich, rich body of literature now out there on Indigenous research ethics. It goes back over 20 years. And so I think with REBs and committees, we need to expect that they become somewhat informed and that they do have somebody who is informed on every REB.
For me, I think, you know, the short answer, which I'm not very good at, is that REBs need to know their role, which is that they need to be ensuring that there is community engagement and consent where appropriate. And then they need to know that it's not their jurisdiction to question Indigenous people doing, for example, an autoethnography about themselves where they're not implicating other people and they're telling their own life story. Indigenous people, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis are rights holders, not stakeholders. I'm going to say it one more time for the new people on the line. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis are rights holders, not stakeholders. And so it is our jurisdiction to decide what happens to our people and on our land. And it's the REB at institutions' role to ensure that we've done so. So that is the simple answer, that the REB's jurisdiction is to ensure that the community has given consent. And that is their only jurisdiction. They don't get to say, if a community says, yes, this can happen here, then the REB does not have jurisdiction to say no. You know, I mean, pending that we're not, you know, taking people's heads off and such. You know, there's clear lines where it's not okay, but I think you get the point.
Yeah. So miigwech, Julie, for, you know, speaking to the role of the REB. We have some people in the room here that would like to follow up on that or have a question.
Sure.
Joe?
Yeah, thank you. So it's Joseph LeBlanc from Dawson. I guess it's just been a question that's been nagging as we've talked throughout the day, and Julie, something you just said around like consent of community, right? So are there thoughts around the community? I understand in Wiki and with the Manitoulin process, it's a lot more evolved than other communities you might go to. So the challenge that I see in this is that like our communities are not cohesive decision-making bodies, right? And Julie, you just mentioned the consent of community. So my question, I guess, is around what is that consenting body and whether there are spaces for us to decolonize this relationship and move away from the band imposed structure, right? So not everywhere has what Manitoulin has. And I have seen and have been a part of projects where council doesn't get it or see it as a priority, yet, you know, moms in the community do. Mm-hmm. So I guess maybe it's building off of Julie's question or comment there is there what body are we seeking consent from?
I for sure don't have the answer to this question, but I will just respond a little bit in saying that I should have said the word collective consent, not community. That perhaps would make it more clear that I don't necessarily mean community like that's a municipality or a band council in this case, though sometimes it might be that. There is such vast diversity in how communities have created their own research governance structures. And I'm only going to speak for the one that I know the best, which is my own. And that is that ours is embedded within the political organizational structure. It is a standalone arm that is embedded within that system, but that we have not separated research governance from governance more broadly speaking. And so when we're having conversations with federal government departments about, environmental impact assessments that are happening, about monitoring and conservation and things that are happening with the animals and the ice flow and the this and the that, we've decided to not separate the two. But of course, there are lots of reasons why that can be a challenge when there are things that, for political reasons, are not being approved when community members actually want it. So that's why we've attempted to, and so far it has, I think, relatively speaking, has worked. That even though we're embedded within that political overarching structure, we have our own standalone committee that's comprised of both community members and non-community members who have expertise, either through education or through experience, on research ethics and how research should be conducted in our territory. And so we make sure that there is unanimous decision making that happens on these projects. So even if there may be something that seems like if it went to a political leadership, it probably would not be approved, those projects still get vetted by us in as neutral a way as possible. I mean, I think other communities have set it up differently, but that's the way that we've done it in Nunatukovut.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, 50% of our populations live off reserve. So they live in urban centers, and I'm sure there is research that goes on in the organizations that they seek services from. So they would provide their input there, but how do you marry the two? I'm not sure what the answer is.
Hello?
Yeah.
Hello? Am I on mute?
No, we hear you.
No, okay, sorry, because when I joined the conversation and said, you're on mute. So, the majority of work that I've carried out, sorry, this is Patty from Canada College First People Center. The majority of work that I've carried out has actually been in urban centers and working with organizations and communities like the Friendship Center, for example, here in North Bay, or the provincial OFIC, the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers, for example. And there are various ethics and I would say bodies that projects run through very similar to communities. So we use the USAE framework, USAE ethics framework that came through the OFIC, and they provide quite a bit of support for urban centers and urban communities wanting to carry out Indigenous research. And as a part of the First People Center and what we're hoping to maybe contribute to the near proposal and development process would be supporting that form of research as well. So creating additional supports and ethics bodies, advisories through the First People Center and our TP model, which Mary Wabano is going to be presenting on the next webinar as well. So I think that there are quite a bit of supports out there for organizations and community researchers who are living in urban centers. It just may not be as well known at times. So I think someone else was speaking to identifying and bringing awareness to the landscape of what is out there, bringing more attention to that and connecting to it, which I agree with. I think there is a lot of work happening. It's just people are a little bit more maybe unfamiliar with it. Sorry, I just wanted to add that.
Oh, Miigwech. Is there anything else? We have time maybe for just one more short question, and then we will close.
I would just want to add that the First Nations, the Chiefs of Ontario, which is the Ontario political organization, also has a First Nations Data Governance Committee, which also vets proposals.
Any questions for that? Okay, so just in closing, I encourage anybody who wants to be added to our mailing list to contact Julia Rowett, and she is the one that coordinated and sent out the invite to everybody. Her email address is jrowett@laurentian.ca. And I just want to say, chi miigwech to our panelists today. Those of you for being here, and those of you who took time out of your day on the line. I think this is, a very important conversation, not just in Indigenous health research, but it applies, I think, to all fields, coming from somebody who's not necessarily in Indigenous health. And I think it's just, I've jotted down notes, and I know we have note keepers here who are recording madly here because there's a lot of really important points made that will go into the development of our grant application. So chi miigwech, and all of you again for attending, all of you on the line for taking the time to listen in and ask your questions. Miigwech. And I don't know how to sign off of these things properly.
Yeah, miigwech, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this.
Yes, agreed. I would just like one final thing to say to the folks who may be new or novice to this. There's a global movement happening in Indigenous data sovereignty, and there are tons of free resources you can find. If you just Google those 3 words, Indigenous data sovereignty, you will find all kinds of really great resources, websites, and folks who are doing this work all over the globe. Nakamik, thank you.
Miigwech. Okay.